And that frontal lobe is where a lot of the executive function occurs. And when I talk about executive function, I'm talking about those elements of planning, organising, setting of goals, impulse controls, planning, decision making. Those sorts of things happen in that frontal lobe. Now, when we talk about the things like neurons are effectively just nerve cells. Okay, and I'm told we have apparently around 100 billion nerve cells in our bodies. And you can see the actual larger picture is of a neuron. And I love this quote by Alan Woodruff from the University of Queensland. He wrote about, when describing what neurons were, he wrote, their interactions define who we are as people. Because, and to me, that was sort of like, wow. So everything about our body is really reliant on our neurons and what's happening to them. And you can see between those two blue neurons is a gap, and that's what we call the synapse. And they're in the brain, and the synapses are there. And you'll see also that there are some little shooting electrical transmissions. It's the synapses, that gap that has electricity that actually gets the neurons talking to each other. So when we are talking today, and I'm going through some of the things that are happening, this might just help you think about, when I'm talking about neurons, I'm talking about the nerve cells. I'm not talking so much about the synapses, but know that the way they communicate is through that, that gap between them actually is not really a gap. It's a synapse full of electrical current and communication. And what really is important at that point in that synapse is what we call neurotransmitters. And I'll be telling you a little bit more about what the neurotransmitters are, but that's where the neurotransmitters pass through. We're also going to be talking a little bit about neural plasticity. And when I look at what neural plasticity actually is, it's about the ability of the brain to change. You think of Play-Doh, and we're talking neural plasticity. It's the ability of the brain to change through growth and reorganization. And if we put it quite simply, is neural plasticity means that we can learn new skills, and it enhances our existing skills, our existing cognitive skills. We can build upon them. And those skills we acquire that we don't really need, well, neuroplasticity allows us to shred it. So it's probably a perfect decluttering agent as well. But these neurons that we have, because of neuroplasticity, we're able to actually adjust our activities in response to the changes in the environment. So when we're working with children, one of the things that is happening all the time is, as the environment changes, children are learning and developing that neuroplasticity, and play is a really important indicator of that. The other thing that I'm going to introduce you to today, which is my new fascination, and it's BDNF is the shorthand version for it, brain-derived neurotrophic factor. Now that's a chemical, and I'm going to tell you more about that. And it's linked in the studies people have done. It's linked to long-term health benefits to have it in your body, and it's also, absence of it also leads us to other. But I'm going to talk a bit more about this brain-derived neurotrophic factor, and it's a chemical that exists in our system, and and it's something that I think is really important, particularly when it comes to rough and tumble play. Now, those neurotransmitters I talked about, they are really they're released from those neurons, those big nerve cells, and they travel across the synapse, which is that gap, and they keep our brains functioning. Now, if you look at what's there, those chemical messengers, if you look at the different names, some of them will be quite familiar to you. We've got 8 transmitters, not about 8, we have 8 transmitters. You'll be familiar with adrenaline, our fight or flight. Now, adrenaline can be good or bad, and we know when we play, we get adrenaline. When there's something risk-taking behaviour gives us adrenaline. The excitement of being chased can give you that adrenaline rush. The other one you'll be familiar with is probably serotonin and the endorphins, and we know those around, the euphoria and the love feeling we sometimes get. And the other well-known one to us will be dopamine. And today I'm going to talk more about dopamine and its relationship to play, because what you might not be aware of is there's been a lot of research done around dopamine and play and how that pleasure neurotransmitter actually helps brains to develop. So that's a little introduction to the chemical messengers that are going between our neurotransmitters. And as I've given you that bit of a background, because I really want to make sure that we understand, firstly, what it is I'm going to be talking about, and I don't lose you halfway through. Because our brain is actually, running all the way through our brain are these transmitters, these neurons. We have got those actual neurotransmitters right throughout our brain. And effectively, they run through the brain, and because they transmit the nerve, they're transmitting sort of the actual brain, keeping the brain functioning. It's those things that play is encouraging and developing. So our brain is effectively developing and growing every time we start to play. And this is where my 30 minutes kicks in, because I've got 30 minutes left to give you really 5 examples to inspire you to start thinking about, the real impact of play, so that you can actually be the champions for play as well, in regards to really understanding this stuff is real, this stuff's important. And unfortunately, we have got too many people in our world not understanding just how important it is. We've taken it for granted. Play's been there, play's always there. But unfortunately, in the quest for the education, in the quest for getting kids in classes and that overstructuring of children's lives, we're losing some of the really important benefits of free, undirected play. I mean, now we call things free play, as if play isn't free. Play has always been free. In order to be playful, to be play, and to be classified as play, it must be self-directed, freely chosen. So now I'm calling that, and this is my new one, I'm calling it child-directed play, because so often we come across situations where play is happening, but it's actually being carefully orchestrated and delivered and sort of monitored and managed by adults. And child-directed play is one of the important and first bits around how children learn to navigate those complex relationships. So when we actually are playing, children start to actually learn how to follow rules, not necessarily the rules that an adult sets, but the rules that children make up between themselves. And they actually learn to pick up on those cues, those non-verbal and verbal cues between their peers and their playmates. They sometimes overstep the mark and they end up in an argument or a disagreement, and they have to actually navigate their way out of that, talk their way out of it. Now, you'll see sometimes children in child-directed play will actually withdraw a little bit, and they'll be the kids that observe, and they sit and observe the play happening. And so often I'm often told people worry about, oh, my child sits back and doesn't get involved in the play. But sometimes that is a child who is sussing it all out. The way they're working out, the way they're navigating the social relationships is they're starting to watch what's happening, who's moving, who's doing this, what they're doing. And when they feel comfortable, they'll start to embark and move into that situation. Every child will take a different approach. But I like to remind people that child-directed play, even the arguments, the disagreements, the examples of times where children exclude or include people, that's actually a child's introduction to democracy. Think about, as a kid, how you chose who went first. Anyone ever played scissors, paper, rock? Anyone ever did eeny, meeny, miny, moe? You might have, whenever I'm in a group and we're face to face, we can go through all the different sort of examples of how we start a game. But child-directed play is children's first introduction to democracy. And there's links, they feel, to moral development, to right and wrong, to fair and unfair, and to understanding, how these relationships work. Now, when we put children in a situation where they're not exposed to these relationships, then they're at a significant disadvantage. I worked for many years in outside school hours care, and I was always amazed at when children would come into the out of school hours service, if it was their first introduction into some form of children's service, if they hadn't been in an early childhood service, their approach to child-directed play and to managing the relationships was far inferior to that of the children who had already been in that situation. So many children were coming into the situation, into the out of school hours environment from early childhood services, already able to not only navigate the social relationships with their peers, but they were able to navigate with the adults as well. They were able to navigate those complex social relationships. They had that experience. And so from that point of view, it's an important role for every child to actually acquire those skills. And they don't acquire it by an adult being there necessarily, always sort of adjudicating or trying to manage that situation. There has to be times that we step back and practice what I sort of like to call conscious incompetence. So we don't get involved, but we're keeping an eye on things. We're conscious of what's happening, but we're basically not going to buy into the discussions or the negotiations that are sometimes children have to have when they're playing a game and they have a disagreement. Another way that you see this sort of participation increased, and I think is through loose parts play. And most of us will be very familiar with loose parts play. But the interesting part about loose parts play and child-directed play is, once again, when you've got children with the loose parts directing how they manipulate the object, negotiating and talking to each other, you've got what they call metacognition. So they're thinking about thinking. And we can actually help a child when they're actually in these situations understand and control their own cognitive performance. So when they're struggling with a loose part, actually saying, oh, what are you wondering about? You know, because they're actually there looking at how to put something together or how to build something that they're trying to make, rather than give them any suggestions, but actually build those cognitive skills when they're using loose parts play to develop their own way of thinking, and they're thinking how they think and how they problem solve. The beauty of loose parts play is it allows children to navigate some very new contexts that they may not have been exposed to before. And it doesn't start with us already having a set mold that they follow. But loose parts, when arranged and just there, allows children to actually recognise and to problem solve. It allows them to actually challenge their own understanding of how things work and what works together and what doesn't. So as you see an activity of loose parts play where children are just allowed to roam freely amongst these loose parts, and you can see in this particular example, these two little ones were they played for hours together, and they were both relatively non-verbal. So they were actually, you know, a lot of it was just, you know, the cues. They were just picking up on each other's play cues. But you could see that the time that was spent there meant that they had actually started to navigate both their social relationships, and also their brain would have been sparking with this particular aspect of play that, once again, is very low cost. It's something that parents might look and say, but, you know, that's, you know, what's the equipment? Because that's not really equipment. But letting parents know about the importance of loose parts play. I've done many workshops for parents lately around loose parts play, and it's amazing how many suddenly do, oh wow, that's all right, I can do that. And they can do it in their own homes, and they can you know, take things outside. And during our COVID lockdowns, we saw a lot of families wondering what to do with kids, and loose parts play was perhaps one of the most beneficial forms of play they could have embarked upon. And of course, this particular aspect of play, in both cases, both child-directed play and which leads to loose parts play, there is that idea of active, adventurous play. Now, when children experience joy and they experience risk, both new and old adventures, you can experience joy and risk in new and old adventures and experiences. What actually happens is neurotransmitters are released in the brain. And what the studies have shown is that these pathways for the dopamine neurotransmitter run through the prefrontal cortex the midbrain and the hippocampus, and it's linked to a whole lot of cognitive benefits, but not just cognitive benefits. What you might not be aware of is dopamine is also linked to physiological benefits. So dopamine actually helps with our heart, our kidney, our digestions. Just Google the benefits of dopamine and you will see it's not just the, what happens in our brain, but it happens all through our body. Neurotransmitters are actually not just benefiting brains, but that they are responsible for the motor control of how things work in our body. And so when our children are participating in this active play, adventurous play, and adventurous might just be simply building a tower with loose parts. It doesn't have to be anything that would be high risk. It is play that creates an environment where children feel challenged, where children actually feel inspired. And so what actually happens with the dopamine and these transmitters means that children develop their executive function. They also learn their motor control. And the more they do it and the rewards they get, they increase their motivation. They increase their desire to learn and to explore. So they're not defeated by these sorts of processes. So the building of the loose parts, yes, it can be frustrating sometimes because things don't go together or you're not sure how you're going to use it. But what actually ends up happening is they end up being able to understand their own ability to actually manipulate objects. And of course, this is around processing and information retention. So what they learn how to manage before, when you've managed a complex relationship with another child, or you've managed to sort of build something with your loose parts, that knowledge is then embedded in your brain and it actually builds on to the next stage. And so the actual joy of play, which people have always thought is, the happiness you get from playing, the joy, doesn't necessarily make anything significant changes. It really doesn't do any change for a brain. Well, now we know it does. Now we know that the joy of play, the dopamine, is one of the critical parts of our brain development, that we get adequate amounts of dopamine so that we are able to focus on our information and we're able to improve our self-regulation. In fact, what I did discover is that ADHD, the Ritalin children receive in ADHD, actually works by boosting dopamine. And so, so ADHD is linked to actually a shortage of dopamine. And so this goes to show how just that important neurotransmitter can make significant changes for our children. And joy is something we need to incorporate. I like to think that is now our own message as educators, to say, how joyful are the environments we are in? Because if you're not in an environment where you have joy, where you can experience joy on a daily basis, you're probably in the wrong environment, because it can't be good for our health anymore. So joy is something we need to add into our list of, what we want to ensure happens on a daily basis everywhere we go, because it's for our benefit of our health. Now, I'm going to ask you now to challenge you to look at another old behaviour. This one is through a different lens. And I like this one. I've always been a bit of a fan of this, and that's rough and tumble play. Now, for some people, when they hear rough and tumble play, it immediately makes you do, oh, I can't stand that. Rough and tumble play is actually, and we've probably known it for a while, but we know from the research that's been done, it's actually very good for you. Now, one of the examples, the example I quoted at the beginning about the third of the neurons changing with the rats, that was actually when rats were involved in that rough and tumble play, because, they're actually, and rough and tumble play, that particular research was done by a couple called Sergio and Vivian Pellis, Pellis, in case you want to check it out. But it showed that sort of rough and tumble play improves social competence, cognition, and emotional regulation. But wait for it, not just now as a child, but later in life. So they were able to study rats further up the chain, and it actually helped you later in life, that rough and tumble play. And the juvenile experiences of play actually allow the brain to be more adaptable later in life, which ties in with that neuroplasticity. Now, why we know that about neuroplasticity is this thing called BDNF. Okay, because BDNF is a key player in that brain plasticity. BDNF is the learning and the memory. It helps, and BDNF exists in the amygdala, which is that at the base of your brain, your fight or flight part of your brain, and it also exists in the frontal cortex. And in fact, what reduces BDNF in the body, in our brains, is cortisol. Now, cortisol is that stress hormone. So when we're stressed, the BDNF is depleted. Now, the one thing we don't want to do is have depleted BDNF, because BDNF actually keeps the brain growing. In order to actually keep our brains healthy, we need to keep adequate amounts of BDNF. And there's links to reduced BDNF and long-term cases of disease, of Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, are related to these sorts of things. A lot of the neurotransmitters and chemicals I refer to, when you track it further down in adulthood or old age, you see that there's actually links between an absence of it and that obviously children had a lot of as children. So the growing evidence is that prefrontal cortex and the executive functions are actually helped by the presence of BDNF. So when we rough and tumble play, and it doesn't have to be rough and tumble play that causes necessary harm, but what it does do, it gives children a context for experiencing the unexpected. And in order for rough and tumble play to remain playful, children have to follow rules, structures. They have to observe the play cues that are being given out. When I speak about play cues, they're the indication that, they look at somebody and they know what they're thinking and they're getting an idea. If you think the most obvious play cue I can ever give you is when a dog wants to play and it goes down on its front legs and sticks its bum in the air. That's a play cue. When a dog comes up and does that to you, that dog isn't going to eat you. That dog is going to, want to play with you, and ideally you'll have something to throw at it because it's ready to play. And children give out these same play cues to each other. And often, on a whole nother topic, sometimes dysfunctional play, where two children, those kids you might have that cannot stay away from each other. They don't get on when they're together, but they can't stay away from each other. And every time they get near each other, and this is more common in primary school, every time they get near each other, there's a fight or there's a problem, but they just still go back like magnets. They're actually often seen as two kids with dysfunctional play cues. They meet, they can see each other's play cues, they recognize the play cues, and so they're attracted to each other, but as a result they haven't yet got the system going for how to actually play properly because they've both got the wrong cues. And that, when you're managing behavior, is something to always look at as to why those kids are magnets to each other. So BDNF is another really good reason why we get children to involve themselves in that rough and tumble type play. And there's lots of safe ways to rough and tumble, but letting people know about BDNF, that rough and tumble play that children often have, and traditionally stereotyping, but traditionally fathers rough and tumble play with their children, know that when they're actually doing that, as long as they're on the gentle side, they're actually helping increase their child's capacity for learning and for memory and for brain plasticity. And finally, the one I wanted to finish with in regards to those 5 things to hopefully inspire you is something I like to call play immersion or flow. And it's traditional, and some people refer to play flow. And allowing uninterrupted time is actually another critical part that has an impact on executive function skills. Now, there was a 2006 report on Montessori by Lillian and else, and they actually identified that they did some comparisons, and traditionally in Montessori there is a lot of time for play immersion and for flow, where children can actually spend a lot of time just focused in and being, playing and doing their activity. And it showed that their executive function tasks for those children who had more time for this immersion was actually better at a higher level than those who didn't have that time. If we think of this in a modern context, the time to get lost in the moment is actually something that you might have experienced as a kid, but how many kids get time for that now? And if I was to track, what's happened over the years, we can sometimes, not necessarily in our services, but in their daily lives, children can sometimes be very pressured to perform, to move on to the next thing, the next thing, and the next thing. And so they rarely get time to actually immerse themselves in the play process or in any sort of process, so that they can have that time to learn. And this is what happens with play immersion. They learn to focus. This is where they develop their ability to focus. This is where they develop their ability to block out distraction and to retain information, and should never be underestimated that we need time for children to be just with the flow and immerse themselves in what they're doing, and keeping them moving through that process in a very slow, considered, measured way. So time to get lost in the moment. And if I really think about it, adults ourselves, we, imagine how our executive function would improve if we actually took time to immerse ourselves, to actually just, to sort of get lost in the moment. And think about yourself, and talk to your educators, other educators, about when was the last time you got lost in the moment doing something. And many people use this as a strategy for relaxation. So it's just as important for children. But for children, it is about developing their capacity for focus, information retention, and for sustained concentration. And it will have results, once again, as they move through the education system and into adulthood. So in summary, self-directed, unstructured play is a biological imperative. Okay? So we need to emphasize that. It sits alongside sleep, nutrition. Okay, it is definitely something every child needs time to do, because of the way it stimulates brain growth. And the way it stimulates brain growth is it releases those neurotransmitters. It releases the chemicals that protect the brain. And when they are having the brain growth stimulated and brain growth sort of protected, what is happening is not just protecting their cognitive function, but also their physiological functioning, their motor skill development. So all of those things that are happening up in the head space actually have implications for what happens in the rest of the body. If we get the head space wrong, if we don't create the right environment as adults for that environment for a child's brain to flourish, then it has implications, long-term implications, for every part of their body. And of course, self-directed, unstructured play allows children to navigate that complexity of relationships. And it does provide a framework, not for democracy, but also for that community participation. Our little ones are learning. This is their first introduction to what it means to be part of a group, what it means to be part of a community. And it might just be a micro community at that point in their life, but this is their first attempt to be part of it. And this is where they learn and they get reinforced. The neurotransmitters will reinforce whether or not they enjoy that experience. Are they going to go back and have more? And so this is where we're at a unique point at their time to ensure that even their play experiences are learning experiences for how they will actually participate in the community in the future. So one of the key things I speak to local government about is the fact that we need to get play right, because if we want social cohesion, play and children's ability to play and have plenty of time for play actually will contribute to the social cohesion in the future for that community. It's a flow-on effect. Everything we do at that level will ultimately affect the child themselves and the community themselves as they grow to adulthood. And your role, as always, Article 31 actually says in the general comment that the role of educators is we support the conditions for play to take place. That's the important role we have, supporting the conditions in which play can take place, whether they be the conditions in your own service, whether they be the conditions in your community, or they're the conditions in your family, but wherever they're happening, whoever you're dealing with, we can actually uphold play, protect play, promote play by actually making sure that people understand what are the conditions for play to take place. We don't need to have, say what the play is. What all our role is to actually provide the conditions for that play to happen. Thank you. I hope that has given you some sort of some thoughts, some things to think about in regards to your own practice. And I hope that it's actually inspired you to realise just how important play is and why I'm so passionate about it.
Thanks, Robyn. I'll hand now over to Kieran, who'll deal with the questions and the comments.
Cheers, Barb. We've got a couple of questions in our chat log at the moment. One from Ken, who I met the other day. Is BDNF related to a specific age group, Robyn?
No, BDNF is in your brain when you're born, and so it's always there. So you know, from my understanding is it's in your brain, and as adults we can sometimes, if we have reductions in it, and it's the reductions in the BDNF that can lead to, so the research is still out on that, but there's links between reduced BDNF to Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, and a few other neurological disorders. But yeah, so it's always there in the brain. And whenever we're doing rough and tumble, it increases. In fact, I think the actual things is the increased levels after rough and tumble play is a research done way back in 2003, yet probably nobody's ever heard of BDNF. And they say that when you put BDNF in a Petri dish with nerve cells, the brain's nerve cells just go off. You know, it's just like boom. So it is a real nutrient for the brain.
Now, Robyn, I've got a tricky one. How does playing games on iPads fit into all this?
Yeah, that's not so much tricky, but they do say with iPads and technology there should be a limit on when children use it. And you know, we see, you know, how often have you seen the baby or the 12-month-old with the phone? That's their entertainment. They hand it. That's actually not great for their eyes. I mean, and this is once again not great for their eyes. We've got increasing rates of myopia in the community in our children, and so whilst technology can be useful, if you are going to expose children to technology, I think technically they've got to be over the age of 2, they say, but they certainly need to, it needs to be limited, because it doesn't replace outdoor experience. It doesn't replace that tangible stuff that you touch. You know, I've seen, and you've probably all seen photos of babies or film of babies who you put an iPad in front of them, or and they sort of are there trying to, they know to sort of swipe the screen, you know, those sorts of things. So it isn't for a child's brain development, it isn't the best thing at this particular point in time. As they get to school age, you know, you will expose them to these sorts of things, but at this point the focus needs to be on children getting out and experiencing and having that interaction.
Thanks, Robyn. Barbara Lewis says some kinder parents ask for kinders that have, or ask kinders to run structured activities to help school preparedness, and it's often hard to convey the importance of play and unstructured play. And Ruth Benson follows up with a question on how do we get this key message, these key messages that you've been talking about, Robyn, through to parents. I'm finding more and more that parents value structured activities more than flow. How do we get the cut through?
Yeah, and I think we get it through by actually trying to explain in as simple terms as possible, you know, at the 6-year-old level, what's happening when flow happens, that it contributes to their concentration. It contributes to this. I mean, we need to be quite definite of this, and obviously Play Australia has a role in that. You know, really sort of we need to get out to parents, and I know that we're looking at doing some work for parents. So the feedback you give us about what parents are saying is going to be really useful for making sure we get those online videos. But really promoting to parents these technical things about, you know, that this isn't us making it up. You know, and I'm sure that all of you have seen these things and have done it over the years, and it's this pressure from outside that keeps coming in. And really what I'm saying is it's time as advocates, we're just going to press back. We're going to just say, no, this is the reality, and we effectively are damaging children if we are not doing these things, because the research is there. It's you know, it's been taken over by people's desire for structure. But in many cases, if you ask some of those parents about their childhood experiences, you may find they either had nothing, that could be part of the problem, or they had a lot of it and they've not even appreciated or remembered the fact that this is what's happening.
And Robyn, they also don't seem to link that with the information, such as a letter today in the Melbourne Age and probably the Sydney Morning Herald from Dr. Ken Boston, who is a world expert and Australian on school performance, and school performance in Australia is going backwards by the hundreds, backwards. And we have to link the importance of play with this disastrous situation that is happening in our school sector. So the structure doesn't work. In fact, it's seriously negative.
And Sally and Lana, your comments about exercise, yes, exercise raises our BDNF, because the other thing is, as I mentioned, the cortisol reduces BDNF. So we know that when we exercise, we reduce the cortisol in our brain. So yeah, exercise, kicking that footy ball, you know, running around are all ways to generate that BDNF. And so I refer to it as BDNF because it's so long to use. But yeah, it's brain-derived neurotrophic factor. But yeah, so exercise is the same. And when we look at exercise or kicking the footy ball around and play, think about those things as they are still play, because children are choosing to do them, and that's how they're expressing themselves. One of the big challenges, in fact, with exercise at the moment is we're seeing an increase in damage in children. ACL injuries.
ACL, yep.
We're seeing an increase in ACL injuries of young kids. Now, one of the things is they say, oh, sport's rougher now, but sport is no rougher. What's happened is we are sending kids twice a week or once a week to a training session, and then they have to get on the field on a Saturday and perform. Whereas years ago, when sport used to be played, yeah, you went to footy training once a week, but all the rest of the week you were out riding your bike, you were kicking football, you were climbing trees, you were doing everything. You were exercising and getting those muscles ready. You weren't just going cold on a Saturday after one training session and being ready for it. And that's the thing. We're seeing this lack of activity, this lack of physical, you know, kids on computers instead of being out and moving. We're seeing that translate into injuries at much younger ages, where kids as young, you know, teenagers are getting ACL sort of injuries when men used to get them in their late 20s. And so these are the things we're seeing in the society, and not linking it up, saying, oh, that's because sport's rougher, or that's this. People make excuses, because it all comes down to what's happening for kids at that young age.
Thanks, Robyn. In the spirit of finishing on time, we've got a couple of minutes left in our session. Was there one key message that you'd like to leave everyone with before we wrap things up?
I would say thank you for the work you do, because I do believe you are the unsung heroes. And I know everyone says it to you, a lot of people like myself say it to you, but it is true. And you have been the unsung heroes during COVID. But know that, you know, one of the most important things you can do is value play for what it is, for the incredible things, the knowledge that's there. When I went through teaching, we were taught there were like 6 types of play, and this is what you did, and you just put it into categories. What we now know is play is so much bigger and so much more significant for us, for not just our kids, but for us as a community, that if we get this wrong, our community is going to be impacted. So I put the challenge out to you, and I hope you'll join in for the rest of the online learning series, and certainly keep your eye out for the parent series that's coming, and you can help promote that through your parent groups.
Thanks, Robyn. I couldn't help but wonder during your presentation what kind of play experiences our current Prime Minister had. But I suppose, you know, I'm not going to get the chance to talk with him about that. So thank you so much for that incredible inspiration. It's been a brilliant start to the rest of our work for 2022. Next week, our members will hear from Ruth Jeans on the important subject of more play for sport and the growth of informal sports participation. A really important subject for our local government members because it's very connected with who actually has access to public open space and who doesn't. And our next early years session will be this coming Monday, and on the title of Taking a Positive Approach to Outdoor Play During a Pandemic with Bron Joslin. Let me say that all of the early years sessions are at no cost to anybody to participate. Most of our online sessions are for members only, and we'd encourage you to become members of Play Australia. Registration details are on the website, and it is 5 o'clock. So that's it from us. Thank you, everybody, and we'll see you next week. Thanks, Robyn.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Can you stay on, Robyn? Or actually, we'll go off and we'll